All right. So in perspective, in any perspective, this is what's happening, right? You have your observer, who is the person, obviously. We'll just put O for now. The observer has a cone of vision, which is what we're seeing here. Cone of vision. They are looking at the picture plane, right? And they are standing on the ground plane, right? What they can see is only in the cone of vision. Everything outside of the cone of vision, they can't see because of the limits of their vision, right? Our eyes are in the front of our heads, not the top or the back, unless you have a serious problem. So since they can only see inside the cone of vision, the perspective you're drawing is taking place within that cone of vision no matter what. Now you can imagine objects outside of that cone of vision and outside of the picture plane, but that is what you're handling, right? Now, the picture plane, if we were to look at it from the front, we can draw a quick one right here. So if now we imagine we are the character and we're looking at the front of this picture plane in particular. And for this example, we're just going to say it's a square, right? So the picture plane looked at directly from the front has two sets of parallel lines. One set is going across and the other set is going up and down, right? On the either side. So inside of the picture plane, let's go ahead and do that. So those are our parallel lines going up, and in a lighter color, I'm going to put them going across. Right? So those are the two axes that are visible when looking flat up against the picture plane. Now, what perspective is when this picture plane, we can see through it, right? Meaning we can see into this, right? Because right now we're talking about just a flat surface up and down, right? So this surface, imagine it's a blank wall, it's blocking our vision. But as soon as that blank wall becomes a window and we can see inside of the picture plane, now we have to see another set of parallel lines. So instead of just a picture plane, imagine this is a cube, right? And now we have the front face going upwards, you know, the two parallel lines that we discussed, but in a cube, you also have, we'll draw a little makeshift cube for now. In fact, I will do it blue. I'm going to highlight the lines we're talking about. So imagine we're seeing the same scene, right? But our character's here. So this is still their horizon line, right? This is their head. This is the picture plane, as we just discussed it, right? So this is what we're seeing. We're just looking at it from a different point of view. But the lines that we're not seeing when we look straight on are these lines right here. This is the other set of parallel lines. So let me go ahead and color code. We got our vertical set, right? We've got our horizontal set. And then we've got our set that's going into perspective. If I was to color code that here, we got 1, 2. Green would be 3. That's not green at all. Green would be 3, right? So that's our 3 sets of parallel lines. So what's special about the purple lines is those lines are meeting a vanishing point, right? Because those are the ones going back into perspective. So anytime we have an object that is showing depth, that object is going towards a vanishing point, right? That object is built on vertical lines going towards a vanishing point. The only lines that are not going towards a vanishing point are lines that are flat up against our picture plane lines. So either something straight up and down, something straight across like the horizon, right? But if it has a surface that is moving into perspective, then that surface is, those parallel lines of that surface are going backwards into perspective towards a vanishing point, and that is what creates the illusion of depth. And so in this case, that would be happening to our ground plane. And there's also, in addition to a ground plane, a sky plane, right? Up here. So the character standing on the ground. Now, technically, the sky doesn't actually have a ceiling to it, right? But when we're in a room, it does have a ceiling. And an artificial ceiling is created by the vision cone. Because without tilting your head up and down, and that's an important concept. What we're talking about here is looking straight forward, right? Not tilting your head up or down. And this is where, when you think of it as a person, which you are thinking of it as a person from a storytelling perspective, but more accurately, it's a camera, right? Because a camera not only has lenses, but a camera is very specifically either tilted or not tilted. Whereas with people, we move our heads all the time, right? So if you were to look at through a person's, that's why when people are filming television shows or movies or whatever, they have Steadicam, right? They have a whole bunch of devices to hold the camera straight. And there are handheld camera operators that are so skilled at moving the camera around without overly tilting it. Because if you were to overly tilt it, then your perspective is constantly changing. And you want a consistent perspective so that the audience can have a consistent view, right? Obviously with art, that's still art, we don't have to worry about the perspective moving. However, understanding that we are choosing the perspective the same way as if we were choosing a camera angle, right? And when we say camera angle, normally we mean, here's where the camera is pointed and blah, blah, blah. But in this sense, we mean literally, this is where we would place our camera, and this is how we would angle our camera on the picture, observing the picture to represent a person observing the picture, right? So this observer doubles as a person emotionally, but is more like a camera functionally. And in this particular case, we're talking about the camera looking straight ahead, not a camera tilted upwards or downwards. We will get to that later. So if the camera is looking straight ahead, then the purple parallel lines here, one representing the ground plane and the black parallel lines representing the ceiling or sky plane, those are the ones moving towards a vanishing point, right? So if we look here, so say this is our picture plane, our square, you want to look at these arrows, right? Not just look at your cube, but think of the parallel lines as arrows going off forever. And then the inside lines would also then, did I draw any more arrows here? No, I didn't. Okay. We can do that now. So these other lines also have arrows going off. Not necessarily, well, they go forever towards us, right? They go forever in this direction. But in this direction, they end at the vanishing point, right? So that is a re-explanation of everything that's happening in one point perspective, right? So if we were to take that a step further, in fact, let's bring this one back. So this is what happens when our observer, let's call him Jeff. In fact, we'll put a nice little J here for Jeff. Jeff, the observer, is looking straight on in this scenario. Now, if Jeff were to move around in this direction, let's look at what would happen. So let's say Jeff moves. We'll do it symmetrically for now. Let's put Jeff right here. And we're going to put another Jeff over here. So we're looking at this from the top, right? So if Jeff is here, we've already explained that. If Jeff is here, it's the same thing. I realize you guys can't see my monitor here. So let's go ahead and name these positions. I mean, you can't see my hand. Okay, so in position 1, Jeff is going to view this in 1-point perspective because Jeff is flat up against the picture plane, as we discussed in the beginning. In the 3rd position, Jeff has rotated around, but we'll see everything from the same perspective, right? However, between positions 1 and 3 in an arc, right? And the arc is important, not side to side, right? Because side to side, he would still be in 1-point perspective. But once Jeff starts to move around in an arc, now what's happening is these planes before, which were, you know, moving totally in one direction, because we're looking at it from the top, right? So before, this plane was going along with the picture plane, right? So the picture plane's here, and this one was looking along that way. Now, these lines were going towards a vanishing point, right? So if we look at Jeff's cone of vision, the vanishing point was created here, and these lines slanted backwards somewhere in the horizon, right? Where they met, where they converged at the vanishing point, if we're looking at it from the top. But now what happens is when Jeff moves to the side, this plane is no longer on the picture plane, right? The picture plane is now here. And with the picture plane being there, now both of these sides, let's call them A and B for now. Now the A side and the B side are both going towards vanishing points because both sides are tilted away from Jeff, right? Look at the direction of Jeff. So Jeff, the picture plane is here, and this side is away in this direction and away in that direction. And now they're creating depth. And so they create 2 different vanishing points out here in the distance. And that's how you get 2-point perspective, is when you take this imaginary cube, and we'll draw just some loose ones for now. Now, to simulate Jeff turning, we're just going to turn the cube, right? Because I can't physically take my monitor and turn it in front of you guys, as you guys can't do with whatever you draw on. So you turn the objects inside of the picture plane, since you have no control over the people outside of the picture plane, right? The picture plane is our world. We control that plane. So we move the viewer by moving the objects inside the picture plane, right? And so here's an example. So I tell you what, for the picture plane, we'll have a purple outline here. That's our picture plane. And we're looking straight into this picture plane. So now when I turn this viewable object to the side, this is what begins to happen, right? Obviously, these are approximations, but we will go into the details of this shortly. But before we go into how it's happening, we need to observe what is happening. So what's happening is this line, this plane right here, we'll call that G for now to represent the ground, right? or F for the floor is more accurate. This floor plane of our cube has now gone from being completely side to side to tilting in space. And because that side is tilted in space and turned away from us, this side becomes more visible, right? We'll shade that side in just to show that same side. And so now these parallel lines here are going to vanish towards or going to converge towards a vanishing point. And that's what creates our 2-point perspective, is the turning of the object or cube that we're observing, right? Is what creates 2-point perspective. And so now we're going to discuss 2-point perspective straight up. But before we do, are there any questions about what's happening here?
No.
I imagine when I start, or if I start working on this, I'll have questions, but right now I don't.
Okay,
but
cool.
I probably will soon.
So the summary of this is, imagine holding any kind of cube or box in your hand, you know, a Rubik's Cube. And hopefully you guys can actually grab something, not right now, but afterwards. Grab any kind of box you have in a room, look at it straight on, and turn that box and look at what happens as that box turns in your hand. Now, before we move forward, what I will say is, we're thinking of the box inside of our picture plane. What I want you to do is, instead of thinking of it like that, imagine your picture plane, right? Now imagine if your picture plane was to fall flat down, right? And we'll draw that line right here. And so the picture plane fell all the way down. Let's imagine this is perfectly equal length right here, right? This is the box we're talking about. This is the cube we're talking about. The cube created by the picture plane that everything happens inside of. So this is like your super cube, right? So for the sake of this lesson, we're going to call anything inside the picture plane a box, and we're going to refer to the overall cube of the picture plane as the cube, right? The cube is our world. Things inside the world are boxes. These are not official art terms. This is just a useful vocabulary to separate objects from the world that the objects inhabit, right? And this is an important distinction, and I'll show you exactly why. So let's say our world, we're going to do a quick little doodle here. So say this is our world, right? This box right here. So if we look at it from the side, say we've got a little city or whatever, right? If we look at this from the top, let's just imagine this is the main building of the city. These are all the other little buildings of the city, right? And they would all be going towards a vanishing point inside this imaginary cube. And if we look at it from the top side, right, this would be our little city inside of the cube. If we look at it from the middle, but turned, this would be our city, right? Inside of this picture plane here. So this is the whole cube moving. And this is the overall perspective of our scene, which is not to be confused with, we go back to the original here, right? Say our original cube, looking at it, imagine we're, in fact, I'll go to a different slide here. Okay. Not to be confused with if there's an object inside of this cube, this object can also turn and rotate in different directions like we did with the original, with the blue box that I first drew. So this means that that object, because it's turning, will be in a different perspective than the overall cube, which is perfectly okay. The main thing that's not different is the object is obeying the horizon line. But the vanishing points on the horizon line are created by the planes of the object. Generally, most objects are in the same exact perspective as the overall cube, right? But imagine, let's say hypothetically, somebody is putting let's say a character. We can actually draw this out, right? Let's go ahead and do this real quick. So we'll do a quick 1-point perspective, right? So let's say we have a character. On here? No, we're not. There we go. Okay, so we have a character at a desk. We got a desk. We got our chair. Just approximating here. We're just going to put a floor to ground everything here, right? And so we've got our character sitting at our desk. Now we're totally to the side of the character and say they're working on their laptop. Everything's all good for now, right? The laptop's also in perspective. It's all good. However, say that character has square-shaped computer speakers. Okay, these computer speakers are straightforward to the character. But imagine those computer speakers are turned. Because when you listen to computer speakers, it is generally wise to have them turned not straight ahead, but towards you. So imagine these are your computer speakers. You want the sound going towards the character, right? This is the character at the desk on the laptop, right? So you want the sound towards you. So the character wants to turn their computer speakers towards them. So now, instead of, and we're going to zoom in on the computer speakers here. So now, instead of the computer speakers being completely straight to the side on the desk, right? The character wants to turn these computer speakers towards them. And now we go back to the old rule where this part is going to be the same, the horizon line, but the speakers are now going to move into 2-point perspective because the character is turning the speakers. So even though, so now they're turning those speakers around towards them, right? So let's say this is the front of the speaker. So even though the laptop might be straightforward, right, in front of us, say it's laptop, there's a keyboard, there's a screen. I realize I'm overlapping, but deal with it. The computer speakers are turned into 2-point perspective because they're being turned to the side, right? So that's what happens when an object is turned on a different plane than the overall scene. Now, this is very useful for city scenes, and we're going to get to actually drawing 2-point perspective in a second. But in city scenes, what you'll see is the buildings themselves, right, are not all straightforward. like so. Some buildings are on their own perspective because people don't build cities on a perfect grid. Some blocks turn this way and streets curve. And when those streets curve, what's happening is we look at it from the top, right? This is what you draw for your city if you're drawing in perfect 1-point perspective. So these are like your streets, right? And these are your avenues, and your buildings are inside of these little squares on the blocks. But that's not how real life works, right? Real life cities are more like this: streets, streets, streets. You know, real life cities aren't built perfectly straight, completely on a grid. It's a grid interrupted by different things going on. And you can just go to Google Maps and literally look at this for yourself. In fact, let's do that right now, right? Let's do a popular one is Washington, D.C. Let's go map. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, perfect. There we go. Image. So we talked about a floor plan before, right? All the city is a large floor plan. So if we were looking at this city, if Jeff was standing way over here looking at the city, right? From the distance, from across like the water or something, right? Would Jeff see this on a grid? Well, this part in the middle over here is on a grid. But look at what happens in this area, right? You see all these slanted streets? Some of these slanted streets are going to result in buildings that are turned away from Jeff's picture plane, right? And those buildings that are turned away are going to be in 2-point perspective as opposed to 1-point perspective. And the buildings that are completely flat to Jeff's view, those are going to be lining up with Jeff's picture plane. Those buildings are going to be in 1-point perspective. And to reestablish this and do the simplified perspective of it, we'll show this from our original picture plane concept. So this is our picture plane. We're above again, right? So Jeff's down here. So now the whole picture plane is still in our 1-point perspective. But say Jeff is looking at a city, as we discussed, some buildings are going to be straightforward like so, but some buildings are going to be turned towards the side, right? And the buildings that are turned towards the side are great for the scene because they make the scene look alive. But that is more work for you because each of those buildings, those vanishing points that are turned away from Jeff and not on this easier picture plane, they have to be drawn according to their own thing. This will also happen in a scene. Say a scene's in 1-point perspective. You've got your street, right? You got your buildings, all good, easy peasy. Life is working out. And then you've got cars. But then one of those stupid cars is turning to go around the corner here. So because of this car's picture planes, that car is going to be in 2-point perspective because that car is turning. So its little square, its little cube is going to be in 2-point perspective because its planes are turning. Now, before we go into actually doing 2-point perspective, is there anything about this part so far that you guys have questions about or that is confusing in any way?
No, I've got it so far, I think.
Okay, cool.
Me too.
So there's one more concept in this before we actually draw the perspective. And for this, we're going to go back to our little cubes that we drew. There we go. Okay. So as the cube is turning, right? The side of the cube that we see more of, that vanishing point is farther away. And the side of the cube that we see less of, that vanishing point is closer. And let's go ahead and illustrate exactly how and why this occurs. So, and in fact, let's go ahead and now we can actually start doing the 2-point perspective for real. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and draw a cube. That cube is too close. Let's move this to the side here. There we go. That's better. All right. So what you'll notice is, so let's say we drew a regular cube. We're going to draw a straight up one here, right? If we turn this cube a little bit in this direction, right? So we're turning it a little bit in that direction, but just a little bit. These lines that are parallel go off forever, right? This side is hidden. This side is visible. And this side is hidden. Right? So if we were to turn this, what happens to all of these lines? So these lines right here, these parallel lines, get represented here. And you see how far apart these lines are when they go off forever? So if you only turn it a little bit and you're still mostly seeing this side right here, let's go ahead and... So you're mostly still seeing that side. Those lines have the farther vanishing point because those lines were really far up. They went, before they were infinity apart, right? They were infinity apart. And now as you turn it a little, infinity gets reduced until the side disappears, right? So it's totally parallel to our vision. And then as it turns, and really, I mean, honestly, this is common sense if you think about it. Let's go ahead and we're going to do a new layer here just to talk about the lines, right? So if I was to just focus on these lines right here, the farther we are from the vanishing point, the bigger the surface is, right? The closer we are to the vanishing point, the smaller the surface is. Because look at the top of the lines, right? Narrow lines, and as we go further away, look at these lines here. The lines start to straighten more and more and more. So that if we were to go really, really far away, we were to go way back here, and we were to draw the parallel lines over in this part of the picture, they would start to be almost straight again, right? They would be almost imperceptibly slanted. So the more angled the lines are, the more that piece is turning into space, right? And the more flat the lines are, the more it's facing us, because the closer it is to the lines of the picture plane. So this is important because this determines where you put your perspective points. One of the hardest things I think for younger artists to figure out is, where do I put my perspective points? Well, the answer to that question is, how much of the surface are you seeing, right? Because if you're in 2-point perspective and you're seeing, now my perspective lines are already drawn here. So the one on the left side is farther than the one on the right side, right? So let's go ahead and draw parallel lines right there. So the object is closer to the one on the left. Let's draw the same object. Let's draw it closer to the one on the right. So if we look at this side right here, we see as that side, the darkened side, gets closer to the vanishing point, that side gets more narrow and more small, right? So if we were to draw that same square, let's draw it real close, right? Oops, let's bring that back. There we go. Okay, so let's draw that real close. So we're going to get it right here. So now we actually see the phenomenon, right? Because look at, so now we see that side is extremely narrow, right? But the other side is almost directly with our picture plane here, right? Because we see the parallel lines on the white face here are, well, not parallel lines, but you know, the horizontal lines on the white face are now so far from the other vanishing point that they're barely angling towards it. They're barely converging towards it. So the closer you get to the vanishing point, the more dramatic that angle is going to be of those you know, horizontal lines, of those lines on that plane. And this is very, very important, because this is how you find your perspective when you're freehand drawing, is you draw the object as you see it in your head, and then you go back and you say, okay, how much of this side am I seeing? And this will allow you to approximate what your perspective is. So now we will finally go into actually working directly in 2-point perspective, just to show how it works. And then if we have time, we get to the thing we really want to do, which is to show how to draw in this perspective everything, not just cubes and boxes and buildings and stuff, but characters, right? Because it's also important for characters. All right, so 2-point perspective. So we explained how we get to 2-point perspective. So now we're just going to show what's going on. And the nice thing is, because of technology, you guys don't really have to work all that hard to find good, solid 2-point perspective. So basically, you have your vanishing points, and whatever, well, really, we'll just draw boxes, right? We'll just draw various boxes here and look at what happens with these boxes when they're in different places. So we were asked a question in a previous lesson about things distorting. And here is your answer. In normal life, there's like a normal distance that 2-point perspective happens in. Because when you see an object, if you're holding, say, a cube in your hand, it's not going to be this dramatically slanted. This means that there's something going on with your lens that's actually distorting the object. Usually in life, when you turn a cube, it doesn't distort. It still looks like a cube no matter how much it's turned. That shows you how far you need your vanishing points to be if you want to retain the integrity of that object, right? And it's really that simple. A 2-point perspective is either an object inside the picture, inside the cube, a box inside the cube, or the cube itself is turned away from the observer so that the side surfaces of the cube are both converging towards vanishing points. That's what's happening in 2-point perspective. As opposed to looking directly at an object, the object is turned, or the scene is turned. So we're looking at the both sides of the object at the same time, you know, the front and the side. Whereas in 1-point perspective, you're only seeing the front of the object in a perfectly square grid. Now that grid looks a lot more like that, right? Now that's what that grid looks like, as opposed to the first grid that we drew. Any questions about that?
No.
Okay. So when you're looking at 1-point perspective, things are more lined up with your picture plane. Exactly. When you're looking at 2-point perspective, things are turned towards the side of your picture plane so that, you know, the horizontal lines are now converging on 2 surfaces instead of just the 1 surface, right? Instead of just the ceiling and the floor, now it's the, you know, the walls and everything else. So moving forward, okay, how does this relate to characters? Quite simple. When you're drawing a character, the character is inside of an imaginary box. These lines are a little close together. We're going to spread these out a little bit. Side, okay. That's better. So your character is inside of an imaginary box. And so when you draw, the skill is to take those shapes that we did in anatomy and learn how to reproduce those shapes in perspective. Obviously, this is very loose, but you guys get the idea. So when we started with these very simple shapes to construct figures. But now we see how, getting rid of the actual perspective for a moment and going more towards a looser perspective. If you're sketching, let's say a circle, that circle has an imaginary cube around it, depending on your perspective, right? So if you have that same imaginary cube, and there's a head inside of that cube, we're going to just shade in the side of the cube here. And then we're going to shade in the side of the head inside the cube. We talked about how everything has a front and a side. So the important thing about this, when I mean honestly, all of this is important, right? But when drawing your characters, the thing I really want you guys to take away from this is that when you're drawing objects on your character, now for the rest of your lives, you're thinking about those objects inside of the cube of the character, right? So if the character is taking place inside this overall cube here, that means if they have little objects on their belt, they have boots. Now, just to say there's a leg here, and say you're drawing fantasy style boots. Now, when you're doing these arcs, you know which way the arcs are going, and you also can imagine the side of those boots. If you're drawing straps or objects, now you know that the cylinder of that leg, the curve of the cylinder, as it transfers in perspective, as it moves through perspective, is going to your objects now have to obey those general, rules and exist in that general world inside of that cube that we're talking about, inside of the boxes and inside of the cube, right? So there's your world cube, and then there's the character inside of the box, inside of the cube, right? So now say we were to draw a scene here. Say this is our scene, and say you're doing your rhythm stuff, so you got your characters, sitting around in a scene, they're all sitting around a campfire or whatever. There's logs, there's maybe mountains in the backgrounds. We got some tree stuff going on. Maybe there's some items on the floor. Maybe they're talking about their stories. So now, once you go in and start to draw that, then you go, okay, what's the overall scene inside of? So say your overall scene is inside of a cube. This is the shape of your picture plane, right? So your picture plane is maybe here, but your scene is in a cube that's turned to the side. So now, if we were to draw the floor of that scene, now we can find our vanishing points because, again, we know this one's closer, right? So that's our horizon line, right? This one's farther away. Cool. And so now those same rhythms and stuff with our characters can happen inside of here, right? And now you can start to have depth in your drawings. You still have your mountains and stuff in the back. Now you can really think about where your trees are, right, in your scene. Bushes, you can think of some storytelling elements in the background and stuff like that. Some objects being closer and overlapping, right? Causing depth in the scene. And now these things are in a world, right? And this is where your stuff leaps into the professional world. And even if you are drawing just one character, right? Just a cool little pose. So say this is your frame, and you want your character to be here doing some kind of pose. They still can be imagined. Let's say there's no background, right? There's plenty of images of characters with no background, but the character can still be inside of an overall cube. I mean, a box, let's say. And that box still has general vanishing points. And now every item on that character. Go ahead and, for the sake of this drawing, so if I were to sketch now, on top of even this really rough, loose image, but understanding how perspective works, if I'm sketching a character in here, and I'm still obeying all the same general rules and ideas of rhythm and stuff like that, but I'm thinking of the character's attitude, and I'm thinking of the character's pose, I'm thinking of the items now. When I come around to that belt, look at how the belt is thinking about these parallel lines, right? And then that belt is wrapping around this pelvic area. And let's say the character's leg, even the leg, right? Even the boot of the leg and the foot are all now thinking about this imaginary box here, that if I were to draw a smaller box and the leg is inside of that smaller box, the general tube of the leg, it's now thinking of that perspective. And say the character has a strap here and like a knife or a dagger or something. Even if I was to draw something here, I'm not going to literally draw a perspective of like this dagger for its own little box. I'm not going to think super duper deep about that, but just having that in mind for every item that I draw on the character puts this character into depth. It puts all of the items in, a world and in perspective, and makes my drawing more believable, makes it more professional, and it allows me to be more creative, because when you're thinking of angles and stuff like that, and you're thinking of designs, and you're thinking about perspective, these things all create different emotions in the character, right? And now we can already hear, even from this super rough drawing, the drawing is now happening in a depth of space that saves me from so many drawing issues, right? This thing doesn't feel right. This thing feels flat. This doesn't feel like it's believable. This object isn't turning in space. Now that the character is in a general environment, a general idea of perspective, now we can really get cooking and draw professional, believable characters, because they look like they're truly in an environment. And that is going to conclude today's lesson. But next, we will have an extended lesson on drawing parts of characters, and particularly heads, inside these boxes. And now that you guys understand 2-point perspective, next week we're going to draw some objects in 2-point perspective and just look at how that behaves on a deeper level. But this is the, I won't say introductory. This is the next level from the perspective discussion we had before. And that concludes today's lesson.
Okay.